to everybody. Hi. First thing I'm going to ask today is please turn off your cell phones if you have them on. Please do that. The second thing I'm going to ask today is, do we have any new OLLI members here today? No. Well, we don't. Okay. All right. Well, then what I'm going to ask all of you then is that if you meet people, if you get somebody new in town, and you please tell them how great OLLI is, because OLLI is a fantastic program, and certainly part of my work here at OLLI is to try to grow our membership. So if you meet somebody, please tell them about how great OLLI is and how much fun it can be and how much we enjoy this entire process. So please do that for me, and then that would be great. Today's class, if you all got my syllabus in my email, if you didn't get that, please make sure I have your email address, and I can make sure that I get information out to you, because I will periodically send out different things that will help you enhance the class via like stuff from YouTube and stuff that I think is appropriate and I won't have time to get involved with. So please make sure I have your email address. If I don't, just get to me between the break or after the class, and we can write that down and make sure that you're online with that. Those of you that are perhaps unaware, when I originally started to build this class, I thought, well, look, I can get this done. Well, unfortunately, once I started getting into the class, I realized that the topic was way too big, and I couldn't possibly finish it in 8 sessions. So I will be having part 2 of this class in winter. It'll be right here in the same location and at the same time. So hopefully you enjoy this section of the class, and you will then come back. That'd be great for me, because I don't really like talking to empty chairs. And the fact of the matter is, I had a great time building this class, and hopefully you will have a great time and learn a lot of things about this topic during this class. So that's kind of where we're at. The one last thing, I know a lot of people have been around with me before, but if you have a question, please just raise your hand. I will do my very best to answer the question for you. If I cannot answer the question to my best ability, or if I think it's kind of lame, then what we'll do is we will have that question start the very next class. Okay, yes?
What are you going to do in the spring? You going to roll over and pick up Korean War, maybe?
Maybe next year.
Is that a firm commitment?
No, that's not, but you've been talking to certain people in the back row, obviously. So anyway, I will take that under consideration. Okay. All right. Anyway, this class is a big class. It's got a lot going on. But what we're going to do is we're not going to start in the 19th century. We're going to go way back, and we're going to start with the Battle of Agincourt. Now, why are we starting this far back? The reason for that is simply that I want to give you a sense of scale about how warfare was and then how warfare changed. So I think if we have a little scale involved, you'll have a better idea as things progress in this class. So, first of all, this picture is nothing like the Battle of Agincourt. I would absolutely guarantee you that archers did not stand 15 feet apart and shoot arrows at each other in a big line. That was not what happened here. So, what is going on with the Battle of Agincourt? It takes place in 1415. There is an English army under King Henry V, and he is trying to get his army back to Calais. They are tired, they are hungry, they are in enemy territory. So they are in a tough situation. And the French, their army is led by a group of nobles, and their goal is to, you would think, keep them from getting to Calais. That's not quite how it works out. So, the French are actually defeated by a much smaller English army. The English army, again, is a lot smaller. They're tired, they're hungry, and the French really kind of messed this battle up. And it's one of the most important battles of the 100-Year War. And of course, the famous Shakespeare play, Henry V, gives us the term from this battle, Band of Brothers. Well, the English army, how big is it? It's got 1,500 men-at-arms. Men-at-arms are what we consider to be armored knights. It has 7,000 longbowmen or archers, and they're confronted by the best guess I could get. There's a lot of debate on how big the French army actually was, but the best number I could come up with is the French army has 10,000 men-at-arms. They have 5,500 archers and crossbowmen, and most of those crossbowmen were mercenaries. And they have 800 or 600 to 800 cavalry. And cavalry is what we look at as knights, you know, a guy on a horse wearing a full suit of armor. So that's kind of how the disparity of forces was. Well, their armament of both sides are really very similar. They have got swords, they've got pikes, they've got battle axes, and they all have, the wealthy have suits of armor. Those suits of armor can be significantly different. If you're really wealthy, you will have a steel plate suit of armor. If you're not so wealthy, you will have a cast iron plate armor with chain mail. That a lesser armor is not quite as good against bows and arrows. Arrows can theoretically at close range penetrate the inferior armor. All right, so there's significant reasons why the English win this battle. As you can see here, the terrain and the nature of warfare are going to be very important in this battle. The battlefield itself is very, very small. It's only 750 yards wide. It is a plowed field between two large forests. So it's like a little slot. So the English have formed a line in that slot, and the French are going to attack them. Now, the English have a huge advantage here because, first of all, even though the French army is much bigger, it can't get around their flanks and attack them from behind. It also negates the advantage they have for their cavalry because their cavalry has the same problem. They can't get in behind the English army. Also, because that field has just been freshly plowed, it has been raining heavily. And now those knights, the French knights that are going to be leading the attack, are going to be walking through mud wearing 60-pound suits of armor, so they're going to tire themselves out. Well, warfare at this time is based on a couple things, chivalry and class distinction. So if you are royalty or a very wealthy landed individual, you will have a good suit of armor, you will have all the accoutrements. You will have things like a horse, for example, which is very expensive to maintain, and you will practice fighting on a regular basis because that's kind of your job. The archers, on the other hand, are generally of a lower class. They are not armored. They are basically just kind of regular people. But in England at this time, the regular people are heavily encouraged to learn how to use the longbow. They are given, you know, there's contests and stuff and prizes, and they're really, really encouraged to use that longbow. And I also think they're probably going to want to use that longbow because it'll probably put some food on the table. So, again, oh, one other thing. The French crossbowmen are primarily mercenaries, just so we know that there's also mercenaries involved in this as well. So, unlike today, yes?
All of the figures that I could see, I know they probably had on helmets, but they looked all dark-skinned. Were they African mercenaries?
No. Well, probably mostly Germans. Or Italians. You know, people that were very common to fight. So probably they looked dark because the paintings were covered with candle smoke from being hung in. Okay. So things all look a little darker in the Middle Ages than they were originally. Anyway, the way you did things then is if you were going to capture a prisoner, that prisoner would be if he was of royalty or landed aristocracy, you would hold them for ransom. So you could capture somebody and make a profit. So this was a big incentive for them. They wanted to capture as many rich people as they could because they could then make a profit on keeping them. So they didn't really want to necessarily kill men-at-arms. Now, crossbowmen and archers and those guys, well, hell with them, you know, so not a big issue. But that is it. The other thing is there is some chivalry involved, and you would be honored or you would gain status if you defeated people in single combat. So that's another piece there. What happens in this battle, it's believed that the French were so incredibly overconfident by their large numbers that they decided to take off after the English in a heated rush. Now, one thing I neglected to mention too is the French are in 3 separate lines. There's 3 separate lines of the men-at-arms, what they are like infantry. Let's look at them that way. The armored infantry, they're in 3 separate lines. That's really important as this battle goes along. So, they're real confident, and they're going to attack without using their archers. They got 5,500 archers, and they decide, you know what, we don't need these guys, and by the way, if they start shooting arrows at these English guys, they might kill some that we could then capture and make a profit on. So they really just decide to attack without their archers, which isn't a good plan. So for the dismounted guys, they are fighting face to face. They are fighting with swords. They are fighting with maces. They are fighting with a javelin, perhaps, or something like a spear. And it really, really is close combat. Literally, it's face to face. So you have a very, very close encounter here. It's nothing like you would see today. So people are literally hacking at each other. The suits of armor, because again, they're very expensive, are actually custom made. They're made by a craftsman. The better suits of armor are going to be custom fitted to you. They're not like you can buy a suit off the rack necessarily. You can't go to Walmart and pick some out. So they are custom made pieces of equipment. Again, very, very expensive. Well, the archers, not so much. And there's a lot of debate about the effectiveness of the English longbow. Those of you that are familiar with the Battle of Agincourt, you always hear that the ability for the English longbow to attack or to penetrate the armor of the French knights is why the English win this battle. I'm not so sure if that's actually accurate. Because like I said, even the wrought iron and the chain mail armor, at long range, that bow will probably not penetrate it. At close range, it will. The steel plate armor, you have to be really close range for you to penetrate that stuff. So, not so sure if that traditional view of this battle is accurate. Well, the longbow itself is a very dominant weapon for approximately 200 years. They are approximately 6 feet long, and they are made of yew, that type of wood. Now, those of you that are familiar with the Mary Rose being raised, it was raised, I think it sank like in the early 1500s. So it's later than this battle. But there were longbows on that ship. And when they raised that ship, they recovered longbows. So we have a very good idea of what longbows really were like at this time. And what's interesting to me about the longbow is it has an incredibly high draw weight. When I was younger, I had a nice fully recurved bow, and it was a 50-pound draw weight. In other words, how much strength you needed to pull it back. The bows that were found on the Mary Rose, the minimum was 100 pounds. They went up to 180 pounds. That's a heck of a lot of draw weight. And when they did excavations for archers that had been killed and then buried, they could actually see in their bone structure how much effort that had taken them to pull back those bows. So you could actually see that there have been changes in their bodies to using these things. Well, when we look at a bow, I would take a bow and I'd hold it like this, and I'd notch my arrow and I'd pull it back and let it go. These bows are so strong, you can't do that. So what they would do is they'd notch the arrow, they'd hold it next to their head, and then lean their whole body into it to make it go, and then pick it up and let it go. So these are very, very powerful bows, but even then, at range, they aren't powerful enough to get through the best quality armor. Well, the maximum range of these bows was 330 yards, and they had multiple types of arrows. But realistically, at 330 yards, you can't hit anything with a bow. So that's much too far range. But they did, again, they pulled these things out of the Mary Rose, they made copies, and they could test them against various types of things, and they could get one of the tougher bows to shoot 330 yards. That probably didn't happen in battle. Okay, so a trained longbowman can get 7 arrows off per minute, but he can only do that for a very short time because of the fact it's extremely hard to pull that bow back. So they can't shoot for that long, but they can get 7 off quickly. An archer would probably have 30 arrows, 25, 30, and what they would do is they'd stick them in the ground. And then they'd pull one up and shoot, and they'd pull one up and shoot. So they had their ammunition, in effect, readily available. At Agincourt, they did something else, though. This is very key. They took stakes and drove them into the ground and then sharpened them quickly, because remember, the English have some time to prepare their position here. The French are coming up and they can see them, they know what's going on, and they decide to build a defensive position. And the way they build a defensive position is by hammering in these stakes. So now these archers are behind the stakes, they've got woods to the behind them, so the cavalry, the knights in armor on horses, cannot get to them. So what happens is they're able to freely continue firing arrows without the cavalry being able to get at them. So the effective range of this weapon is probably about 220 yards. Horses at this time, when you see a movie of cavalry charges, you see the horse like running full speed. That's really not how cavalry operated generally. They generally operated at a trot of maybe 15 to 18 miles per hour. So at that range, you would be able to fire your bow 3 times at those advancing cavalry. Okay? Problem with that is, though, the cavalry can't get at you. So you're safe. So you can just keep shooting arrows at people, and they can't affect you. Well, contemporary accounts talk about wounded horses crashing into the advancing line of French men-at-arms, their infantry. And what happened there most likely is horses at that time were armored only in the front. So when they're letting go these clouds of arrows, the horses are being injured in their backs and their flanks. They are then become uncontrollable, and they crash into the French men-at-arms, causing a lot of problems for because their units are getting broken up. What else is happening? The French men-at-arms are being deluged with arrows too. So these advancing French infantry are having clouds of arrows come at them. So what they're going to do is they're going to close their face masks. This has 2 effects. First of all, they can't breathe as well. Second of all, they can't see, and it's hot. Now they're walking through a muddy field wearing 60 pounds of armor, and arrows are coming at you. What are you going to do? You're going to start running. You're going to start going as fast as you can. So now they are even more exhausted when they reach the English line. Well, in close combat, the French that fall, because they're in this mud and they're tired, they literally can't get up. They're on the ground. They can't get themselves off the ground because people are fighting around them, and it's just a big mess in that front line. And then I told you about a second line and a third line. The second line decides we're going at it, so they charge in as well. And now they begin to push their own troops into the English line, so that it becomes more and more and more compact, to the point where the French are almost unable to use their weapons. It becomes basically a big mess. Best way I can put it. So, at this point, the English archers are out of arrows. And they decide, well, let's get into the battle. And so from the sides, the English archers, who aren't armored, so they can move quickly, they pick up virtually any weapon they can get their hands on, a knife, a sword, even the mallets that they use to drive the stakes in the ground. They go after the French knights that are now in this compacted mass, and they begin to attack them from all sides. What happens, though, is for some reason, and I can't answer it, the French cavalry does not intercede. The French third line does not intercede, and they let this thing go on while basically they're watching it. So their own guys are in major trouble, and they're not doing anything to help them. Well, the French begin to fall. They begin to pile up. There's reports that some of the French that fell down into the mud actually suffocate from being compressed down into the mud. And then the French men-at-arms, the knights, begin to surrender. Well, of course, the English are glad to do that. They're glad to take their surrender, because if they take their surrender, they can make a profit. So they start taking prisoners. Well, yes?
Is that where the term soldiers of fortune got started?
I would think possibly, but I would think more like mercenaries, really. But I don't really know. I could look that up. Try to remind me. Okay? So anyway, the French had another force nearby, a small group of knights augmented by local villagers. And the English have what's known as a baggage train. That's their supplies and their wagons behind them. Well, this small group of French knights and local villagers decide, hey, we're going to go attack the baggage train. Well, that's a good deal for the villagers. They can get some free stuff. So people are not really wealthy at this time. So anyway, they go in after the baggage train. Henry V becomes extremely upset. And he decides that what I'm going to do is I'm going to kill the prisoners. He orders them to kill the prisoners. Now, his men don't want to kill the prisoners. First of all, it's not chivalrous to kill a surrendered guy. And second of all, it's going to lose that profit motive. If I kill this guy, I can't hold him for ransom. If you look at John Keegan, who I recommend as part of this class to read some of his books, he will suggest that perhaps what Henry V here was doing was trying to terrorize the French knights that surrendered, because Henry V is afraid. And remember, these guys are still wearing suits of armor. There's weapons laying around. They could easily bend over, pick up a sword, and start fighting again. So he's very concerned about that. So Keegan thinks this is more of a terror issue than a real issue. Well, like I said, the French third line never gets involved. The cavalry never gets involved. The French archers, 5,500 of them, never get involved, and they all begin to withdraw. Well, when that happens, Henry V is going, woohoo! You know, I'm in good shape now, because quite honestly, I don't have to worry about this, so he stops killing the prisoners. So, what is this about as far as command and control goes? Henry V is definitely what you would call a heroic leader. It would be heroic leadership. Again, this is from John Keegan. The classic is Alexander the Great. So Henry V organizes his troops at the beginning of the battle. He then actually joins in the battle. He's in the front ranks of the battle, so his only really command and control feature he has in this battle is moral support. So his troops see that the king is right there in the front ranks fighting with us. The other piece that we see in this is flags. So we have flags and banners. So if you need to follow the flag, or if you have to retreat, you know to run to your flag, because that's where you're going to reorganize. And that's where we get the term today, rally round the flag. That's where that comes from. So that's how command and control is. It's all by word of mouth. It's very, very simplistic. The French, though, Their whole attack is a disaster because of incredibly poor planning and lack of leadership. First of all, their goal is to prevent them from getting to Calais. There is no reason that they need to attack under such unfavorable conditions to go after the English. There's no reason other than that I can see except a profit motive, or they were just so incredibly overconfident. Second of all, if they had used their archers, that would have been more effective. If they would have used their cavalry better later on in the battle when the melee starts, then that would have been more effective. So basically, you're having this issue of them having no centralized control of their military, and that causes their defeat. So, at this point, all fighting is by muscle power, really. There are siege cannons have been invented, yes, but they're not used in this battle at all. There was reports that there were some arquebuses used in this battle. An arquebus is a very primitive, smoothbore rifle-type gun. That's the best way I can put it. And so none of this machinery is available at Agincourt. So you see this being a completely, really completely muscle-powered battle, animals and humans. The most important part of the battle, in my opinion, is when the melee breaks out, when an uncoordinated free-for-all starts, when these archers go in and start to attack the French knights. I think that's, in fact, the turning point of the battle, and the fact that the French fail to do anything about it certainly causes them to lose. So, if we look at weapons at this time, a sword is 31 inches long. A pike can be up to 14 feet long. A bow, a yew bow, will fire an arrow 220 yards effectively. That kill zone doesn't really expand much, even at Waterloo, as we will see today. But by the first Industrial Revolution, starting in 1760, all that will begin to change. So let's look at the first Industrial Revolution. It's from 1760 to 1840. This era brings about the use of machinery and machine tools. Those machines are powered by steam, they're powered by water, but this begins a huge change from people using little craftsmen to using factories. Where does that come from? Oh, iron and chemicals are vastly improved as well. I should have mentioned that. So the production of iron is vastly improved, and chemicals are starting to become much more important to way of life. So things change immensely. Starts in England. It's primarily based on the textile industry, as we can see from this picture from about 1830. And again, it leads to factory systems, mass production, and the ability to have interchangeable parts. Waterloo takes place really before many of these things can be affected for their use at Waterloo. So Waterloo is still, even though it has gunpowder, is still pretty much a battle more akin to Agincourt than it would be akin to battle today. Well, Waterloo takes place on June of 1815. Napoleon Bonaparte has been forced into exile. He has returned. He is now trying to gather an army together to fight the Seventh Coalition, which is a group of European powers that do not want Napoleon back in power and want to end French attempts at hegemony in Europe. So the English force under Wellington is a mixed force. It is English troops, Dutch troops, and what's known as the King's German Legion, which are German troops attached to the English army. Also, there are Prussians under, you ready for this? Look at the name. It's pronounced Blodheer. Now, when I look at that name, I'd look at Blucher, but the proper German pronunciation is Blodheer. And the way I remember that, it's really quite simple. I just think of President Trump in a windstorm, and that's how I remember Blood-Hair. So, Napoleon's strategy is to keep the enemy forces separated and destroy them. This is always his plan. Armies are separated. He tries to get them together and crush them as individual forces before they can unite. He is also trying to get this done very quickly, as we will see, and he's trying to keep the British from gaining access to the sea. Be just kind of like Agincourt, if you think about it. Trying to keep the British from getting to the sea where they can be resupplied. So he knows he has to win quick because of the 7th Coalition will bring in very much more forces soon as they get themselves organized. And what he's done is he's taken French troops that were originally conscripts, and we'll talk about conscripts later. He'll take French troops that were originally conscripts but have also been trained veterans. These guys have all been fighting for years. And as officers come to join him, he begins to just slot them in to whatever group is available. Well, with that being done, what happens is these veteran troops aren't necessarily confident that these officers that they're getting paired with are going to be someone they can trust. Wellington, who's in charge of the English coalition army, he is a brilliant defensive tactician. He has a tremendous eye for terrain. He always fights, if possible, by putting his men behind a hill so the enemy can't see where they all are and find his weak points. Then when they attack, he counterattacks on their weak points. He also has another incredible skill. He has a tremendous sense of timing. He can look at things, look at forces, and see how long it would take them from move to place just by observing them. So the famous story is he's looking through a spyglass and he's eating a chicken leg, and he's looking, and these French are moving along, and all of a sudden he takes the chicken leg and throws it away and decides that we've got to attack right now. And the reason they have to attack right now is he has seen that there's a gap in the French forces that he can exploit if he moves quickly. So he has this great sense of timing. So again, he is a tremendous tactician in that regard, and he has a tremendous eye for terrain. Well, under the Prussians under Blood-Hair have been defeated at Ligny and forced to withdraw. But the Prussians have excellent staff work, and they are quickly reorganizing their forces. Well, what happens is Napoleon is convinced that he can exploit that because the Prussians will take too long to reorganize and he'll be able to attack Wellington. He also sends 33,000 men under General Grouchy to go after this town that he thinks where the Prussians are going to be. Unfortunately, the Prussians have slipped away and are going to be able to aid Wellington. So Wellington says, look, I will stand at Waterloo if you will support me. And the Prussians say, we can be there the next day, so you go ahead and make your stand at Waterloo, and that means the battle will start that next day. So the French and the Prussians have a better plan in place than Napoleon has with his own army. So that's a huge issue. By their commitment to be joining the battle, even though late at Waterloo, they will be able to be an influence there. So Napoleon is absolutely convinced that he can defeat Wellington before they arrive, but he is wrong. Well, let's look at this. So Napoleon has 73,000 men. He has a huge superiority in cannon at 252 to 156, but he doesn't have a big superiority in manpower, 73 versus 68,000. Plus, there's that 50,000 Prussians that are available. He has 33,000 under Grouchy, but he's got to get them into place, and command and control will be a problem with that. So, the French plan is to have a feint on the left side of their line, that would be here, at a farm called Hougoumont. So at Hougoumont Farm, and what the thought process is once they take Hougoumont Farm, they will be able to force Wellington to shift forces to his right or their left, and then they will launch a major attack with artillery at the center of the English line. They will break the English line and then send their infantry forward. What they don't count on is this. These are the Prussians. And the Prussians will arrive late in the day. So the battlefield compared to Agincourt is 2.5 miles wide. Agincourt was 750 yards. But still, it's not hugely different. The other thing is command and control is still based on word of mouth, written orders, and people on horseback. Napoleon and Wellington do not take part directly in the battle. They are not heroic leaders. If anything, to use John Keegan's term, they are anti-heroic leaders. But they are able to use the higher ground to see what's going on, and they will then direct their forces, which are significantly larger, but are still not ridiculously large compared to the previous battle, Agincourt, and their command and control, again, is very, very simple. So, warfare has changed significantly because of Agincourt, primarily because of gunpowder. But we see that gunpowder isn't really that huge a change because the weapons are slow to fire, they're incredibly smoky, and the other thing about them is they have an issue with rain. If it's wet, and it's wet at this particular battle, that they will not necessarily fire. So swords and halberds and these kind of weapons are still very, very much usable and are not obsolete because gunpowder isn't very effective. I've got a picture here. The thing with the circle around it is a halberd. The halberd kind of looks like a spear, kind of looks like a battle axe, but then it's got that hook on it. And what that hook is for is to dismount cavalry. So when cavalry comes by, you hook them with that thing and try to drag them off their horse. So these weapons are not obsolete by any means at this time. Guns are not standardized. So I will go to a gunsmith, my unit, and say, hey, I need guns, and make me some guns. And for many of the armies, they're not standardized. And so guns might have different calibers. So ammunition, the balls, all have to be made separately, and that causes a problem for logistics of these things. Also, these guns are smooth bores. They're muzzle loading smooth bores. They're much easier to manufacture, they're faster to load, and they're vastly more reliable than the very primitive rifles that are available at this time. Rifles are available. And all long guns, most importantly, hold a bayonet. So if I'm in the attack, I'm probably going to shoot 1 or 2 rounds, and I'm going to run forward and try to stick the enemy. And with that happy thought in mind, we are going to take a very short break. I will be starting back again exactly at 1:30. Okay. I said that many countries did not have standardized weapons. The English actually did have a sort of standardized weapon. It was known as the famous British land pattern musket, and we'll talk about what that means. It's the Brown Bess. Nobody is sure where the name Brown Bess actually comes from, but they believe that because the barrel was made of iron, it was covered with a brown coating to keep it from rusting. And no, Bess was not Queen Elizabeth. If we look at a pejorative term in Australia today for a woman, that would be referring to her as a Sheila. A pejorative term they believe in England at this time was to refer to a woman as a Bess, and that type of woman would not necessarily be the nicest type, perhaps a woman of ill repute. So the Brown Bess indeed gets its name from that. Why is it a pattern musket? Because there's no industry to mass produce guns. And you actually can go to the Tower of London and see these patterns. They would have these patterns of what the weapons were supposed to look like, muskets and swords, etc. And a craftsman would go in there, and he'd start taking measurements and look at it and draw little pictures. And then he'd go back to his little workshop, and he'd start hammering these things out, right? And so they wouldn't be certainly exactly the same, but they'd be close. And over 120 years that this gun was used by the English Army, which is an extremely long time, they made 4.3 million of these guns. Now, it's a smoothbore musket, but if I had a part break and I needed to get another part, well, that part wouldn't necessarily fit perfectly. So what I would have to do is I'd have to hammer it or file it or do something with it to make it fit into my gun so it worked properly. So yes, indeed, they are very similar, but they are certainly anything but identical. About 11 pounds without the bayonet. It's heavy. Because, and we're going to explain this in detail, so it's going to be a little bit challenging, so stay with me on this one. This is a flintlock. It cannot be used in wet weather. I will explain that shortly. So, let's just start at the beginning, how this thing works. All right, I'm going to load this gun. It's a muzzle-loaded gun. So I have a packet in a paper that has gunpowder and has either a ball or a buck and a ball, which is a couple pieces of buckshot and a ball to go with that. So, what I'm going to do is I'm going to take that paper and I'm going to take it with my teeth and rip it. I'm then going to take that gun and pour that down the barrel, some of it, not all that gunpowder, but some of it. Then I'm going to take that ball or that buck and ball, and by the way, that ball is really large. It's 3/4 of an inch ball. That's a really large round. And I'm going to drop that down the barrel because the barrel is bigger than the ball. And it will fall to the bottom. Then I'm going to take a piece of that paper, I'm going to wad that in, and I'm going to jam that down so if I move my gun, the ball doesn't fall out. Now, then I'm going to cock the gun. There's a pan next to the barrel, about right here by my head. And in that pan, next to that pan, there's a hole that goes into the barrel. I'm going to take the rest of that gunpowder, I'm going to pour it into that little pan, and then when I pull the trigger is not going to act like a hammer. What it's actually going to do is scratch a flint next to that pan. And that scratching that flint will ignite the powder, hopefully. If it's not raining, it will not. And then that's going to go down that little hole that's in the barrel, and then that's going to shoot the gun, and the ball is going to come flying out of there. So how does that look? It's really weird compared to a modern gun. I'll try to find a good video of it and send it out. So what it does is, so I've got everything ready to go. I pull the trigger. So what happens is I pull the trigger, this thing goes, flashes in my face, makes a lot of smoke, then eventually it fires the gun. So it'd be like, boom. So there's a big delay, and not only does that, but it's disturbing my vision. So there's a lot of issues going on when you fire a flintlock. The black powder itself is a problem because it'll foul the barrel, and again, it's incredibly smoky. So, and these guns will misfire quite frequently. So they are not exactly a dependable weapon. They're completely undependable in a rainstorm. By the way, it's drizzly at Waterloo. Yes, sir?
I'm guessing that the bowman could get off more arrows in a minute than the people firing.
We're going to get to that in a second, but the question is, can a bowman get off more rounds than a guy firing one of these? Absolutely. They could, at best, get 3 rounds a minute. So, it's not a very accurate weapon. The Brown Bests didn't even have a rear sight. Didn't need a rear sight because, quite honestly, you can't hit anything with it anyway. They did a test in 1811 where they made a target that's the size of a line of infantry. Not one infantryman, but a line of infantry. They had guys 100 yards away under perfect conditions firing ball at this thing, and they scored 53% hits at 100 yards. Now, my suspicion is if they'd fired buck and ball, they would have gotten a lot more hits because they got 3 things coming out of the barrel at one time. But the buck shot is probably not going to incapacitate you. Yes, it's going to hurt, and yes, you're going to be in trouble unless it hits something vital, though. Most likely, you're still going to be injured, but not certainly incapacitated from that buck shot. at 100 yards. Again, 3 shots per minute, and that's under ideal conditions. So if you're in combat, the odds are that you're not going to hit the target 53% of the time unless you're using buck and ball. Then you would have a better chance. So very inaccurate weapon. And very short-ranged. So infantry tactics at Waterloo fall into multiple types. Mostly are linear. But the most important type at Waterloo is the infantry square. And that is depicted here. Actually, that's from the Civil War. But at the beginning of the Civil War, they still tried to use these tactics. Not a particularly good idea. But anyway, so what you'd have is like 500 to 1,000 men. And they would form into 2 to 4 ranks. And they would make a square. And the middle of the square would be empty. And the reason you did that was because cavalry couldn't bust up your square, because horses, first of all, will not charge into people like that. And second of all, they can't get behind you because you've now made basically a human fortress. So it's a really good idea to stop cavalry, but the problem with it is it tends to reduce your firepower. So if I'm facing this way and the enemy's coming from this side, I've only got a quarter of my total firepower going in any one direction. And I can't turn around and start shooting. I have to stand there looking in the wrong direction while the battle is going on behind me. Very, very difficult to request that of infantry. So, the square is proof against cavalry primarily because a horse will not charge into that mass of humanity. The horse will shy away. So what you would do is you would get the square. It would approximately be 20 yards to a side. And your goal in the square was not to fire too late at those horses, because if you kill a horse too late, it's going to crash into you because it's wounded. And it'll be out of control. So you would fire at a reasonable range, but you didn't want to fire too late because, of course, you want that horse to shy away, not bust up your square. Because if you bust up your square, you are in trouble. So the other thing is they would fire in ranks. And the primary reason they would fire, well, let's just demonstrate that. So I'm in 2 ranks. So I'm in the first rank, and I get the order to fire, and we all fire at the same time. Then I get down, I start loading my gun, and the guys behind me, they stand up, and they fire their guns all at one time. Now, why did they fire their guns all at one time? The reason is because the flash from that pan could theoretically set off somebody else's gun because you're in such close ranks. So you wanted everybody to shoot it all at one time, so all that flash and stuff would all happen at one time and not cause misfires. Now, it's essential not to break that square, because once you break it, the cavalry can get you. So regardless of casualties, you must stay in place. You can't leave. So if I got my back to the battle and people are shooting me, I can't turn around or do anything. I have to just stand there and take it while people around me are getting wounded and killed, particularly by cannonballs and things like that. Okay, how do we break a square? Best way to break a square is to have infantry and cavalry attack at the same time. Why is that? Because my infantry line can stay, let's say there are 1,000 guys, so we've got 1,000 guys attacking plus cavalry against a square of 1,000 guys. I have a firepower of 1,000 rounds. The square only has a firepower of 250 rounds because they can't shoot at me if I'm coming from one direction. If they break, the cavalry's going to get them. So they can't break. So that way you begin to shoot the square down man by man, and then hopefully they will break and run away. And then your cavalry cleans them up. The other way to break a square is to use the cannon. The cannon is invented in China, they believe. It is a very, very old weapon, but by the time of Waterloo, it has become vastly more efficient. It is able to move on a battlefield much better. Early cannon were only used for siege warfare or attacking cities. But cannon by now have become much more mobile, and they're normally cast in bronze, and they came in many different sizes. But the French have come up with a great idea. They have standardized their cannon under the Gribouvel system. So the Gribouvel system basically says we're going to make all our cannons in 3 sizes. There's going to be 4-pounders, there's going to be 6-pounders, and there's going to be 12-pounders. And so consequently, their guns have a standard size of ammunition, and it's much easier for them to have their logistics be good. What else? The Gribouvels use a Dutch process, and what the Dutch came up with is they would cast a bronze cannon in one single piece. They would then use a very primitive drilling method to drill out the bore or the barrel of that gun. What that did was it made that gun much more uniform. And what happens when you make a gun uniform is you can reduce windage. Okay, what is windage? Remember, a cannonball has to go down that barrel, so it's got to be smaller than the barrel, and it has to go down in there and then fire it. Well, there's going to be a gap. So the more you can reduce that gap between the ball and the walls of the barrel, the more power you're going to be getting out of your gunpowder. So, boom, you fire the gun, but there's leakage. So if there's a lot of leakage, that ball isn't going to go as far, and it's not going to be as efficient. If you can reduce that leakage, then that ball is going to go a lot farther, and mostly you're going to use a lot less gunpowder. So you also have changed your logistics issue. With now you have less gunpowder to use, and it's a much better system. So you definitely want to reduce windage. So the Gribouvel system also creates a lighter carriage. So the gun is more mobile because the carriage itself is lighter, and it's easier to move with horses or people if they have to kind of move it around a little bit. Well, these guns do not fire a lot of what we would consider shells, explosive shells. They don't really fire a lot of those because explosive shells, for numerous reasons, but the biggest reason is that it's a cannonball, so it doesn't have a contact fuse, so you have to use a time fuse, and that time fuse has to be set to the proper time so it blows up when you want it to. It's pretty difficult at this time to do all that. So since the ball doesn't have a contact fuse that explodes when it hits, it has to be done by a timer, and the timers are very primitive and hard to set. So not a lot of explosive shell is used. They do use this thing called canister. And what canister is, it's a can of basically lead balls, and it turns your cannon into a giant shotgun. And cannon at this time had a maximum range 12-pounder of 1,800 yards. At 1,800 yards, you couldn't hit anything. So that's totally ridiculous to even consider it. But at 900 yards, you might be able to hit something. And if you're trying to hit something the size of a square, 20 by 20 by 20, in order to hit that thing, you needed to be within 600 yards. Now, you're still safe from musket fire at 600 yards, so it's a good way to break a square. And theoretically, cannon could fire canister to 575 yards. I totally disagree with that. I think if you could get 300 yards out of a canister round, that would be your absolute best. But canister is a great effective weapon if infantry is charging at you. So that will help you a great deal to defend yourself. So cannon has a lot better range. There's also horse artillery. This is usually a 4-pound gun, so it's lighter. And so the cavalry people have their own little cannons that they can bring up quickly and use to help to break a square as well. Yes?
What is the size, diameter, and weight of the canister shot? A single canister shot, how big is that?
The ball, you mean?
Yes.
Well, like I think about they're by weight. So I'm not sure exactly how big the bore is per weight.
I just meant one of the BBs.
Oh, in a canister? Oh, they varied hugely. Depends on who's making it, really. It could be scrap, too. They used to just take old pieces of metal and glass and throw that in there, too. Yeah, not even like shrapnel. They used to call it like... No, grape shots are bigger, and those are designed to take out the sails and the masts of ship. But they had a name like Scrabble or something where they would just jam anything they could in these cans and fire that. So anyway, the problem with cannon is they can only fire like one shot a minute. So if infantry starts to run at you, you better have some infantry to protect you because you're not going to get a lot of rounds up before that infantry's on top of you. So same with cavalry. If cavalry's coming at a bunch of cannon, you better have somebody there to help protect you, otherwise you're going to lose those guns. Cannon are line of sight weapons. They cannot fire indirectly. Indirectly means I'm firing at a target I can't see, but I have somebody telling me where my rounds are landing. That capability is far in the future. They don't have that capacity. Yes, indeed, they have mortars and they have howitzers, but those weapons, again, are really only to attack cities or something you can actually see what you're hitting. So there is no indirect fire available. They're incredibly effective against the square as long as they're not attacked by opposing infantry. So the cannon is a very, very effective weapon for this time because they're basically only worried about people with hand weapons or muskets that don't have enough range to affect them. But they can be attacked by counter battery fire. And what counter battery fire means is I'm going to use my cannon to destroy your cannon. So if I've got cannon out in an open field 600 feet or 600 yards away from a square, and they're firing at the square, and I've got my cannon behind the square 300 yards, their cannon are in range at 900 yards. So I can begin to try to shoot my cannon to destroy their cannon and break up their attempt to destroy my squares. So the Battle of Waterloo has many, many, many key moments. Probably the most famous is the defense of the farm at Hougoumont. The British hold that, or the English hold that all day long. So Napoleon's plan to force the English to thin out their center never occurs. Marshal Ney, the very famous French marshal, he sees the middle of the English line repositioning. Remember, the bulk of the English are behind the hill. You can't really see what's going on. Plus, there's like all this smoke. It's incredibly smoky from all that black powder. And he misinterprets what's going on and thinks that the English are beginning to retreat. He orders an unsupported cavalry charge. They have no infantry with them, and he charges after the English line. The English immediately form squares. They are incredibly brave. And even though they are under intense cannon fire from the French guns, they do not break their squares and they completely defeat Ney's cavalry. Huge, huge change in the battle. Okay, so what about Grouchy, the French general with 33,000 guys? He never gets communication from Napoleon because he's too far away to get involved with the battle. So Blödhelm has managed to get around and away from him and comes in on Napoleon's flank, and Grouchy never knows that's going to occur. He cannot get information from Napoleon to move his troops to help stop that Prussian attack. So the question or the thinking would be, if Napoleon would have had something like a telegraph, this battle could have turned out vastly different because the Prussians would not be able to launch that flank attack and force the crush. They actually crushed the French at that point when that happened. So that lack of command and control causes this part of this defeat. The fact that the Wellington and the Prussians have talked out a better plan beforehand, even though they don't communicate with each other afterwards, they actually have a much better plan in place. And neither side really changes their plans. So if Napoleon could have changed his plan, if he had a telegraph, for example, he could have easily made redeployment of Grouchy's forces, and that extra 33,000 men would have been at the Battle of Waterloo. So certainly command and control is an issue there. Well, we've seen gunpowder weapons have changed warfare significantly, but the biggest change really is that it's just so much easier to train people to fire a gun than it is to teach people how to fire a longbow or how to operate a sword or a mace wearing a suit of armor. So you can make your armies much quicker and much larger, and populations are larger too as well. We'll see that. But the expectation was still that a lot of this primary fighting was going to be face-to-face with bayonets and swords and halberds. And so the gun is certainly important in this battle, but it's certainly not the war winner we would see later on. And so because the gun's kill zone for a musket is actually less than a longbow, the size of the kill zone actually hasn't expanded to nearly the amount that we'd expect to see by, let's say, 1860 in the American Civil War. And command and control is still by men on horseback, delivering handwritten notes or actually verbal orders. So there's no capability to have significant amounts of, communication at any sort of long distance. And yes, that is the French surrendering. Well, they would have flags, but signal flags, if you're talking about I could make control by signal flags like the Navy would do, remember, it's smoky. They can't see that stuff. And some armies did indeed begin to deploy signal flags and reflectors, but again, not at this time, really. You'll see that later on where they would try to communicate simple directions by flag. But again, you can't really give you solid command and control by trying to use semaphore. And again, with the smoke of gunpowder at this time, semaphore is pointless because you can't see anything anyway. So that's unless it's windy. If it was windy, it would blow the smoke away. But it's a good point, but it really wasn't a factor at this time. It is a factor in the navies, and we'll talk about that when we get there. So Napoleon's defeat ends French dominance of Europe. His conscript armies, because the French had a conscript army, that will change warfare in the future significantly. Their spectacular use of modern artillery, modern being debatable, but at least their use of artillery to break squares, etc., is studied for many, many years after all these tactics become obsolete because of advances in the First Industrial Revolution. So they'll still be studying Napoleon when the American Civil War comes around, and that's probably not a very good thing to have done. Well, how do these weapons work? Okay, so first of all, in the First Industrial Revolution, I mentioned that chemistry had become important. And Edward Charles Howard discovers mercury fulminate. He also defines a way to refine sugar that we still use today, and he was way into meteorites, and an iron meteorite of a certain type is still called a Howardite today. So he's a very interesting character, a great chemical engineer. And what mercury fulminate will do is when you smack mercury fulminate, it will detonate. And that's really going to help change how weapons work, infantry weapons particularly. So we talked about how the flintlock worked, and it wouldn't work in wet weather. Well, there's this other guy, Reverend Alexander John Forsyth, and he likes to hunt birds. And when he's hunting bird with his flintlock, he'd pull the trigger and that thing would flash and make noise and it would scare the birds away. Well, he thinks to himself, that mercury fulminate might be a good idea. So he comes up with the first percussion cap. So a percussion cap is when you smack it, it causes the same effect as that pan would, only it's much smaller and much more instantaneous. So then the cap lock is the percussion cap is refined by making it out of metal. The first ones weren't. They were still made out of paper. And that piece is debated as to who invented that. There's a long story, you can look it up on the internet if you want, about how somebody stole the patent and made a profit on the thing. But the way this works, you can easily convert a flintlock into a matchlock by taking the pan off and getting rid of it. Then you still got the hole in the side of the barrel. So you load it the way you still did, but what you're going to do now is you've got a nipple with a cone, and you put that into the side of the barrel. And then where that little red circle is, that is where you put the percussion cap. So now you modify the hammer just a little bit, so instead of scraping, it smacks that percussion cap. When it smacks that percussion cap, the percussion cap ignites, it shoots a flame into the cone flame goes into the barrel and ignites the gun. So now you have a gun that will fire in wet weather, though it still has a paper cartridge to load. That's still a problem for logistics, but it's a much, much better. So by the 1830s, all major modern armies at that time will have adopted this system. Okay, the next piece is rifling. And this is very, very important. So you can see here, that is what rifling looks like in the inside of a barrel. And what the idea of rifling is that will cause the bullet to spin and be much more stable in flight. The other thing about it, since the bullet has to grip that rifling, it will create much less windage. So again, you will get a much more efficient weapon because there's not all that blast going along the sides. This is every bit of powder now is pushing that thing out the barrel. So the range is going to increase of weapons greatly. The way that the first rifles were from the 1600s, and in order to use that gun, you would load it pretty much the same way, but the ball had to be slightly larger than the barrel. And then what you would do is you would take a mallet and a rod and hammer that thing down to get it to grip that rifling. So that's not a very good process to be using in the middle of a battle, okay? You really need to load a little quicker than that. So to make those barrels in the before machine tools were available, was incredibly slow and laborious. A craftsman would have to drill out that barrel time after time after time to make that rifling. And it was a very difficult thing to do. If you were going to try to make a cannon that was rifled, which people did try to do, you would have a thing called a mandrel. That's a reverse image form. You would put a hot plate on that mandrel of metal, and you would hammer it to fit over that mandrel. Then you would take it out, turn it around, make another piece, and then try to fit the two together. Incredibly laborious, very difficult to manufacture. So the idea of the rifle, of course, is to impart spin and to use its power of its powder much more effectively. How do we get to the modern rifle? With the mini ball. And the mini ball is a huge advantage. The mini ball will be able to is smaller than the bore of a gun. You can drop that thing down and it will go down to the bottom without having to, but it's still got to engage. So how does it do that? Well, French officer Claude Minié comes up with the idea, and that's this one on the right. This, I can't even see it, there it is. So see that, what his idea was is he made this conical bullet, and it had this little iron piece in the back, and then he'd put a little piece of more of lead. The whole thing is lead except for the little piece of iron that holds it in place. And that little piece of lead then, when you'd fire the gun, would splatter, would help the bullet grip the rifling and spin out. It's a pretty complicated thing to make. But he also had those 3 grooves in it. And the 3 grooves, what they would do is they would fill those with grease. And that would help to clean the bore out and to make the gun work much better. So after you fire it around with black powder, again, you have a lot of dirt. So then Captain James H. Burton comes up with the plan, well, you know, this is kind of hard to make with this piece of iron in there and this flange and all this stuff. Why don't we just hollow out the back like a shuttlecock? So now when the gun fires, that back, because it's hollow, opens up, that grips the rifling and it spins out the barrel. That is the type of bullet that is primarily used in the American Civil War. Well, so we look at a model 1861 Springfield. This gun will shoot much further. Yes, at 100 yards, buck and ball is probably just as effective at this gun. But over 100 yards, this gun is much more effective, and to use linear formations of men in a big line or to use infantry squares, it becomes in effect suicidal in the face of rifled muskets. So even a minimally trained soldier can hit a square at a reasonable distance. Accurate to 500 yards, not so sure because sights were not that good at that time, so it's kind of difficult to figure out how high I've really got to lift that gun up to shoot 500 yards. But again, it shoots way further and much more accurately than a muzzle-loaded musket. And so this now puts artillery in range of infantry fire much sooner. So now you can't take your cannons and run them out in the middle of a field and start banging away at infantry squares, because they're going to be able to shoot back at you much more effectively. So that changes as well. Still using the paper cartridge. An interesting story on the paper cartridge. So in India, in 1857, the British issue the Enfield rifle to the Indian soldiers. There's a lot of unrest in India at this time anyway, but the Indians refuse to bite the cartridge because of the grease on it. The Muslims feel that that grease is pork fat. The Hindus feel that the grease is beef fat. And when the British demand that they use these weapons, that causes the revolt of 1857 in the Indian Army. It's an interesting side note to this type of gun. So, that's not the only thing that's been coming around with the Industrial Revolution. Because of the percussion cap, we can now make the modern bullet, and we have the ability to make modern type, very similar to modern type guns. Excuse me, the first one would be the Sharps carbine. That is the gun at the top. It's an 1848 pattern and becomes the standard weapon of Union cavalry in the Civil War. The way that works is it's a breech-loading gun. It doesn't load down the muzzle. It opens up the back of it like a modern weapon. So you would pull the trigger guard down. That would open the breech. You would put a paper cartridge in there. You would close the breech. Then you would put a percussion cap in, and you could fire it. That gun will fire, no problem, 7 times in a minute. So if a regular musket will at best fire 3 times, you're shooting a lot faster. Then, thanks to our good friends at Smith & Wesson, they invent the first actual copper cartridge. And a gun is made to fire that thing, which is called the Spencer. That is the gun in the middle. You can put 7 rounds up in the stock. You cock the Spencer, it loads the bullet in, you close it, you pull the hammer back and fire. You can fire a Spencer 20 times a minute. Then we come to the Henry, and that is the bottom here, and that's how you load it from the front. The Henry is an amazingly advanced gun for its time, 1861. The Henry has a 16-round magazine. It is the father of the famous Winchester. You cock it, it loads and cocks the gun at the same time, and you just pull the trigger. It's a very fast gun to fire. Boom, boom, boom. So, they're a little fragile. They are never issued to the military. Part of that is an interesting story, too, because Lincoln sees these guns, and he says, this is exactly what we need to win the war. And the head of the ordnance, the general in charge of Union Ordnance, says, oh, yeah, okay, Abe, no problem, we'll get right on it. And he's like going, I don't think so. Because first of all, if I give these to my soldiers, they're going to shoot way too many bullets, they're going to waste a lot of ammunition, and consequently, you know, it's just going to be a logistic nightmare. So if a muzzle-loading gun was good enough for me, it's good enough for them. Well, Abe does hear of this, and eventually that guy gets a bit of trouble, and they begin to manufacture guns that are much more effective, but unfortunately, it's kind of late in the war, so they don't really get a lot of these out. Again, with the Henry, only 8,000 are built. The Henry is actually purchased by individuals because they think that gives them a much better chance of surviving the war. And Mosby, the famous Confederate raider, says, That damn Yankee gun, you load it on Sunday and it fires till Saturday. So even the Confederates knew that they had a tremendous advantage in firepower with these weapons. Well, that brings us to cannon. Have cannons improved much? The answer is no. The 12-pounder Napoleon is the standard weapon of the Civil War. It is still made of bronze. It is a smooth bore. It is a nice gun. It's light. It's maneuverable. It's reliable. The Union builds 1,156 Napoleons. The Confederates build 501. Some of them are built out of iron, which has a tendency to blow up because they lose control of a copper mine in Kentucky. It could fire any kind of shell that was available. It's a very versatile, smooth bore gun, but it doesn't fire any further than the same guns at Waterloo, and it's just as slow to load. So there's realistically no advantage in this gun. Well, that brings us to rifled cannon. Now with the Industrial Revolution, we can make rifled cannon a little bit easier. They're still difficult to make, don't get me wrong, but they are available now. So there's lots of different types. There is the 3-inch ordnance rifle. There is the James rifle, which is a bored-out Napoleon. They put grooves in it. And there is the famous Parrott rifle, which actually was invented in 1860, and by 1861, the Union was already starting to deploy this at the First Battle of Bull Run. Problem with the Parrott rifle is it was primarily an iron gun, and again, it had a nasty habit of blowing up on you. These are all muzzle loaders, so you have to fit around into the barrel to get into the grooves from the front. That brings us to the Whitworth. The Whitworth is a breech loading, as you can see in this picture here. It is loaded from the rear. This is much more effective. And you can see the shell of a Whitworth is already got the grooves built into it to fit into the rifling. So it doesn't have to grip the rifling from being fired. It's fitted into it. So you fit that into the back of the breech, you put in some powder, you close the breech, and that gun's ready to fire. So it's much faster, and it's incredibly accurate for its time. It has a range of 10,000 yards. Can't hit anything at 10,000 yards, but it does have that range. You can hit something at 2,600 yards because you can see that. Because remember, everything is line of sight. It is still a gunpowder weapon, so it's smoky. That's a problem. But these are very limited in the service. Only 50 are ever introduced to the Confederacy, but they are used kind of like sniper rifles to attack enemy artillery. And that is an incredibly effective and modern version of a gun, very similar to what is used today, as far back as 1861. It is sort of adopted by the British Navy, but because of the breech. And remember, Navy guns are much bigger because they're on a ship, they don't need to be that maneuverable. In order to use a lot of powder to fire that big round out of that breech, those breeches tend to fail. And the British Navy says, whoa, this isn't good. So Whitworth Company says, hey, what we'll do is we'll just reduce the amount of powder and it won't be a problem. Well, when you reduce the amount of powder, you also reduce the muzzle velocity. So the British Navy says, you know what, we can't use these Whitworths because, first of all, they're dangerous, they can blow up. We're going to go back to muzzle-loading rifled cannon. So the Whitworth gets put on the shelf. And the reason they want to do that is because that the English Navy knows that in the future, all ships are going to be armored, and they're going to need that extra power to break through that armor. And with that, I thank you for attending today, and we will see you all next week.